So, by now, we finished the first step and most of the second step. So we have a program that we can use to make a list of all the possible targets on our target website. It'll extract all the links, and from these links we can obviously send data if there is an equal in the link. The second part of the second point is to be able to extract the forms as well. Now, we already built a program that can extract forms, and we spoke about how this works in details. So what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to start copying code from here into my class, and as usual, I'll have to modify a few things to get it to work. So first, I'll need to import Beautiful Soup because that's what's used in order to extract the forms. And then I'd like to have a method in here called extract forms. And this method would take a URL, and when it finishes execution, I want it to return all the forms in the given URL. Now we already have something that'll do that, which is implemented in here. So I'm just going to copy these 3 lines. I'm going to paste them here, and I spoke about how to do this in details in their lecture. So I'm not really going to go in details about how these 3 lines work. If you don't remember how they work, please go back and revise the lecture. Basically right here, we make a request to the target URL. So in my object, I'll need to do self.session to make that request through my session. And this is going to be a GET request. And this request should be made to the variable that we're getting here as an input, which is called URL, not target URL. Then we're using Beautiful Soup to parse the response that we get from the above request. We're storing the result in a variable called parsed HTML, and then we are using a findAll method to find all the elements that has a form tag. Now, instead of saving this in a variable, I'm going to return all the form tags that we discover. And that's this method done. The next thing that I want to do is to be able to submit these forms. So I'd like to have a method called submitForm. And I'd like this method to take the form that we want to submit, the value that we want to set the inputs to in this form, and the URL of the page that this form was extracted from. This is important to know where we're going to submit this form to. Then I actually have code in here that we use to submit stuff to a form. So again, I'm going to copy all of this and I'm going to paste it in here. And going through this code quickly, you can see it's going to extract the action. It's going to join the target URL with the action. Now in this example, the target URL was the URL which we got the form from. But in this example, the URL where we get the form from is going to be passed to this method in the URL variable. So this is going to be the URL in here. Then we're extracting the method. So forms can be sent using get or post, and we're extracting it in here. Then we're extracting all the inputs in this form. We're iterating over them one at a time. We're getting the name, the type, and the value of the form. And then if the form is a text, if it's a text box, we're setting its value to test. So I'd actually like to set its value to the value that we pass to this method. So I'm going to remove test and set that to value. And finally, we're adding this input to our dictionary, which we then send as a post request. Now I actually don't want to store the result in a result variable. I'm just going to return the result. Now, one thing that I want to modify in this code is we are sending the result at the end as a post request. And like I said, most forms use post as their method, but not all. So let me show you an example in here. if you go to DVWA and go to XSS reflected, we have a form here that is vulnerable to a vulnerability called XSS. And if we just right click this form and inspect the element, you can see that the method in this form is get. So our code is going to extract this form, set its value to the value that we pass it, but then it'll submit this value to this form using post, which is incorrect and it'll actually not work. So what I want to do in here, I am already extracting the method from the form tag and it's stored in a variable called method. So I'm going to check if method is equal to post. If it is, then we're going to send this as a post request. And this should be sent in self.session so that it's sent as part of my session, not as a new request. And if the method is not post, this will not be executed. And what we're going to return is self.session.get. And we're going to give it the post URL. And this time, instead of saying, let me just increase the size of this. Instead of saying data is equal to the post data, we're going to say params are equal to my post data. So you can see the arguments are actually very similar. The only difference is we're checking if the method is post, then we're going to return the result of posting the post URL with the posted data, but we're giving that to the data argument. Otherwise, we're going to return the result of sending a GET request with the post URL, and we're sending the same post data, but we're just using the GET method this time, and we're passing the post data to a params argument instead of data. And that's it for this code. It'll allow us now to, first of all, extract forms from a specific URL, and it'll also allow us to submit a form, so this should be called submit form, by calling this method, giving it the form, the value, and the URL which we found the form in. So let's test this. First of all, let's try to extract this form from this web page. So I'm just going to copy its link. And in my program, instead of crawling, I'm actually not going to crawl. I'm just going to say I want to call my vulnerability scanner dot extract forms, and I'm going to give it this URL to extract forms from it. And we're going to run the code, and I should actually print this because I didn't print it. So let's say forms are equal to this, and let's print my forms. And perfect, as you can see, we have a list. It contains only one element, which is the form that we see in here. Next, let's try to test submitting something to this form. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say response is equal to vulnerability scanner dot submit form. We're going to give it the form as the first argument. So it's going to be my forms 0 to select the first element in my list, which is the first form. We're going to give it the value that we want to submit, and let's submit test. And finally, we're going to give it the URL which the form exists in, and it is this URL. Now this is very rough testing, and we're actually going to use these methods in our class later on to discover vulnerabilities. So I'm just making sure that these methods that I just built work. So let's run this again. And again, I forgot to print it. So we're just going to do print response.content. Run it. And as you can see, the value that I'm submitting is being submitted because it's saying hello test. And this is basically what happens when you put something in here. So if you type test and submit this, you'll see it'll say hello test. So right now, using our Python program, we're able to extract forms and submit them. Now, in the next lecture, we'll continue building on our scanner and you'll see how we can use it to discover vulnerabilities.